Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We are, as you know, in the 5th week of the course talking about sentence processing. In the last lecture we talked a little bit about what are sentences, how do we work with sentences, what is parsing, a little bit of that, and today we will kind of try and look a little bit more in a more detailed sense into what parsing could be about. So let us move ahead. Now, one of the kinds of sentences that researchers have been really interested in understanding are have been referred to as the garden path sentences. Now, garden path sentences are typically, as the name suggests, they are like paths in a garden, you know, all kind of going round and round, mishing into each other and all of that. And why is this metaphor really taken is because these sentences are very hard to make sense of. There are multiple structures, multiple paths that you can take to understanding each of these sentences. Most paths are kind of valid paths and you do not know exactly which is the correct path. Okay. And this is also kind of presents a challenge to the scientist in order to understand which is the exact path that the particular comprehender or listener is going to choose. What are the rules he is going to kind of employ in choosing this path, how is this path going to lead to the correct interpretation of meaning. So, in that sense I hope you understand that it is kind of interesting for a linguist or a psycholinguist for that matter to understand how people are going to process these garden path sentences. I am taking an example again from Traxler, not one of the best examples, but this is the example here. So, the horse raced past the barn fell. The horse raced past the barn fell, or the horse raced past the barn fell. Okay. So, there can be many readings of this sentence. The horse raced past the barn fell, the horse raced past the barn fell, something like that. So, one of the things about garden path sentences is that you can kind of come up with multiple readings of these. Most readings will be grammatically acceptable. There will be many possible structures and you have to be able to choose the correct grammatical structure and interpret the correct single intended meaning of the individual. Okay. This is why garden path sentences are interesting. Now, how do we deal with this? Obviously, we have to do a little bit of parsing, but before we move ahead with parsing, let us try and understand that also. Now, syntactic parsing, as I was saying, is basically understood as a particular mental process or a set of mental processes that takes the sequences of words, everything that you kind of hearing, and organizes them into hierarchical structures. So, it organizes them into structures wherein, like, okay, this is this particular phrase, this is that phrase, this is the head verb, this is the head noun, and this kind of structuring will give you an idea of what is the correct reading of the sentence and what is the correct interpretation of the meaning of the sentence. Okay. If you kind of want to understand it in terms of how the brain must be doing it, or how a neural network must be doing this, so you can kind of think of that a number of equivalent representational schemes can be come up with, all of these representations. So, how do you represent this sentence? Option A, B, C, D, E, all options are possible. So, these can be kind of represented and they can be physically represented as pattern of firing of the sense of neurons, and whichever one kind of wins, whichever pattern of firings kind of wins becomes the accepted representation or the accepted intended meaning of the individual. That is basically how this really works. You do not really have to think about the physical representation part for now. What you really need to understand is that syntactic parsing is basically a set of mental processes that kind of evaluates different representations of a sentence that are possible and organizes these words into these particular representational structures and helps us choose the correct structure. Okay. Now, if there is a process, there must be a processor sort of. So, there is a hypothetical device called the syntactic parser, and the syntactic parser can be thought of as a device or a mechanism that carries out processes in identifying relationships between words in sentences. So, this processor or parser basically kind of starts taking up words, organizing them on the basis of their relationships with each other, and this organization broadly kind of helps you understand the whole sentence. Okay. So, this is this, and now if you have to kind of we can move ahead. What we have to actually do is we have to kind of look at some models of parsing. But before we do that, there is let me give you a brief idea of how this enterprise really happens. So the idea is that the listeners are continuously listening for whatever is being said. So sentences, they are kind of attempting to organize them into particular structures. Sometimes what can happen is, on at least in these grammatically ambiguous sentences, the garden path or the globally ambiguous sentences, the listeners will build a wrong structure for this for some temporarily ambiguous sentence, then discover that okay, this is erroneous, this is not the correct grammatically acceptable thing. When they get to the disambiguating information, which is, say for example, while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. So they will realize that while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor will go that side. Okay, so they revise their initial syntactic construction and syntactic and semantic commitments, and then kind of they latch on to the correct idea. So that is broadly what we are planning to do. Okay, Lynn Frazier gave this very interesting theory called his theory was called the garden path theory, which was basically there to understand how people process these garden path sentences, and he said that this is a two-stage theory of syntactic parsing. Let us look at the two stages. In the first stage, the incoming sequence of words is analyzed to determine what categories these words belong to. So one of the very important information in understanding where each of these words will basically or how each of these words can be grouped, which are incoming from these sentences, is by understanding what categories do they belong to. Is this a noun, is this a preposition, is it an article, is it a verb, is it an adverb? All of that knowledge you need to have, and that knowledge will help guide you, it will help you put things that go together in one particular phrase or in one particular clause. So no other information besides word category information is used in the initial process. So they are saying that in the first stage of the garden path processing theory or garden path parsing theory, basically what you will just get is you will get the information about word categories. So that is the important part. In the second stage, you have to kind of now go towards the meaning. Okay, you have to kind of generate a particular acceptable meaning, and this acceptable standard meaning has to be computed by applying semantic rules to the structured input. So basically you kind of on the basis of this knowledge about okay, this is the structure, these are the word categories, you kind of put some organization there, and then you kind of evaluate their plausibility in a semantic manner. Is this making sense, is this not making sense? If this is making sense, the process is alright, it ends there. If it is not, then let us repeat the process. So let us see what is it what is done in the second yeah. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So the first stage basically in a bit more detail is that there is this lexical processor, and this lexical processor basically identifies the categories that are represented in the input, and its output is basically fed into the syntactic processing mechanism. So the lexical processor is just looking at words, adding category information to it. So you can look at the bottom of the slide, there is this kind of output that you can expect. So conjunction, noun, verb, determiner, noun, verb, preposition, determiner, noun. So this could be, say for example, the output that would come out of reading this sentence. While Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor. So while is a conjunction, Susan is a noun, was verb, and was dressing is the noun and verb. So this is basically there. So noun Susan, was dressing is the verb, determiner is the, noun is baby, played is verb, preposition on, and then the determiner the, and floor is another noun. So this is basically how this mapping needs to be done. This is the kind of output that will come out of the first stage, that is the lexical processing stage. Then what happens is that the parser kind of builds an initial syntactic structure for this string of categories. Once a syntactic structure has been built and the actual words have been assigned to these positions, the entire configuration is sent to what is called a thematic interpreter. So this is where the second stage of meaning making has to start. Now the semantic interpreter, this thematic interpreter, the thematic interpreter basically what it needs to do is it needs to apply a set of rules, and that assigns roles to each of the elements in the syntactic tree. So you saw the syntactic tree earlier, now you have this conjunction, noun, verb, and you have to kind of make this tree and assign role to them. Where will each of these elements go in that tree? Based on their position in the tree and how they are connected to each other, all of that has to be factored in. For example, grammatical subjects are treated as being old or given information. Say for example, if a sentence starts with a particular grammatical subject, that is a given, that is considered as the initiator of the action. Okay. Now, if the thematic interpreter can produce a meaning that makes sense, as I was saying, in the first iteration the thematic interpreter kind of finds that okay, this organization is alright and this already is making sense, then the process shall end, else the process will kind of go back and revise again, and this process will keep on iterating again and again till you come up with a thematically, semantically and syntactically consistent reading of the sentence. So, that is basically the idea. Now, let us look at the characteristics of the garden path theory in some more detail. Now, the parser here begins to build a syntactic structure as soon as the lexical processor begins to deliver information about word categories. So, as soon as the information starts coming about word categories, okay, the first one is noun, second is verb, third is determiner, etc., etc., the structure also starts being built almost on the fly, almost in parallel. Okay. The thematic processor also appears to work on a word by word basis. So, the thematic interpreter is kind of also going as in when each of the words are coming, the thematic processor is attaching or integrating that to a particular structure that could make meaning. Now, the semantic interpretation also of the sentence, your reading of whether the structure is going to make sense or not, also does not wait till the end of the phrase or clause, and basically what is happening is that the listeners are monitoring the meaning of the utterances constantly and in an evolving fashion, okay, and they only stop, okay, this way if I am going it makes a wrong sense, let me revise my reading of this way. So, for example, a lot of times if you are in a conversation, sometimes you say a word and somebody kind of, or somebody mishears a word, they kind of ask, okay, what did you say, in order to just revise. So, this process of understanding is happening is happening constantly, and it is happening in a continuous manner as well. So, as I am saying, you are understanding. If you get confused, you will kind of pause or rewind back. In a normal conversation, we might as well ask the other speaker, saying, okay, what are you saying exactly, because based on whatever I heard, my meaning interpretation goes in a particular direction, but say for example, I do not really think that this is what you might be meaning. So, I am requesting you to do it again, to say this again, so that I can kind of start on with a new structure. More often than not, you do not really need to ask, you just kind of can revise your interpretation on the fly without really anybody knowing about it as well. This is basically what is happening in parsing. Now, this rush to interpret, somebody might ask, why are you in such a rush of interpreting and why can you not do it at the end of the sentence? Obviously, that is probably the correct way to do, but then probably the process will not remain as fast. So, the cost comes, the speed comes at a particular cost. So, there is this rush of interpretation that obviously sometimes leads to interpreting mistakes. The parser, as all of us know, is prone to mistakes as it is forced to choose between alternate structures compatible with the correct input. So, whatever current input is coming, many structures can be compatible with this kind of input, and the parser has to choose the correct. Obviously, the parser will kind of make mistakes some places. Okay, so rather than waiting for the definitive information or making a mistake, the processing is disrupted whenever a mistake is made. Now, there are two issues that any theory of parsing, especially the garden path theory, needs to address. Is how do people make choices when more than one syntactic structure is possible, question 1, and the second question is how do people parse sentences in the first place, how do they come up with sentences with these structures in the first place. Now, let me answer this to some detail. Now, people usually can build only one structure at a time. This is what the garden path theory is saying. So, the garden path theory is a serial processing method, and it says that people will be able to build only one syntactic structure at the time. If that fails, they will come back, remake another structure. If that one failed, they will come back, remake another structure. So, this is a serial processing model 1. The parser relies on a simplistic idea, it relies on simplicity, and what it basically is seeking is it is seeking to develop the simplest syntactic structure. So, the simplest meaning, the most plausible meaning is the one that the parser will go with. It would take less time and it involves lower cognitive resources, so that you can come back and redo all of the job again if the mistake is there. More often than not, you will probably not make so many mistakes and the process will remain fast and efficient. Now, the parser could do this by following some heuristics, shortcuts that is, and these heuristics basically are the basic rules that can be applied very quickly, and these rules can be applied to make decisions about which structures to build at any point in time. The advantage of this is this keeps the process fast. The disadvantage is obviously there is a cost attached to this. Now, let us look at some of the heuristics that have been suggested under the garden path theory of Lynn Frazier. One of the first heuristics that I can talk about is the heuristic of late closure. What is this heuristic of late closure? It says that the parser does not need to postulate any unnecessary structure. If possible, it will continue on to work on the same phrase or clause as long as possible. So, while Susan was dressing, the baby played on the floor probably happened in this sense because you are following this heuristic. While Susan was dressing the baby, everything is being attached to the same. You do not really go on the you do not really create another structure unless absolutely necessary. So, while Susan was playing the baby was dressing the baby played on the floor. So, the baby it kind of remains there and played on the floor kind of becomes the next structure. This is how late closure operates. This is basically what I was going to say here. So, the late closure principle says that the first organization will be pursued because it allows the parser to continue working on the same clause for a longer time. Okay. So, while Susan was dressing the baby, played on the floor. However, you later realize that dash played on the floor is not really correct, and so you will kind of then move on to the second, but that will happen in the second iteration if you are following the principle of late closure. So, this is one. Another heuristic that we can take up is the heuristic of minimal attachment. You do not attach. So, when more than one structure is licensed and consistent with the input, build the structure with the fewest nodes. So, in your phrase structure tree that you are developing, you should have least number of nodes. The more nodes you have, the more complicated the structure is, and the idea that the system seems to follow is that of minimal attachment. Let us look how that rolls out. So, there is this example: the burglar blew up the safe with the rusty lock. Now, there can be many interpretations. The burglar can come up here, blew up the safe with the rusty lock can be the second one. The third interpretation could be the burglar blew up the safe and then with the rusty lock, that could be another one. Now, the initial grouping, the second one, the burglar and blew up the safe, it has only 2 nodes and less than the later. Minimal attachment says build up the tree with the fewest nodes. So, people here while reading this sentence will go up with the initial grouping. However, it will generate an error message. Why? Because blew up the safe with the rusty lock kind of can lead, okay, the rusty lock is not really a dynamite, so you cannot blow up anything with that rusty lock. So, that kind of leads to an incorrect interpretation. So, people will need to revise it. When they revise it, then they will find the following sentence easier. So, the burglar blew up. So, if you have to really go with the minimal attachment, this sentence is the more plausible one. The burglar blew up the safe with the dynamite, and then if you kind of go with the burglar and then blew up the safe with the dynamite, kind of leads to 2 kind of structures, lesser nodes. This is what will give you the correct interpretation, because this is what kind of comes out with minimal attachment. Okay, with the initial example that wouldn't have worked. So, moving on, third heuristic that people might be following is that given a choice between 2 structures, we can basically build a structure where the new elements relate to the main assertion of the sentence. So, the idea is given a choice between 2 structures, we have 2 structures possible, we have to build a structure where the new elements relate to the main clause or the main idea of the sentence, main assertion of the sentence. Let us look at how that works out. There is these examples, sentences 13 and 14. The young woman delivered the bread she baked to the store today. Another example is the young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store today. So, once again reading this, sorry. The young woman delivered the bread that she baked to the store today. The young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store. These are 2 different sentences. Now, let us try and understand the main assertion thing. The main assertion is when you have main assertion heuristic says when you have a choice of where to attach the new information. So, in this sentence, what is the new information? In the first one, baked to the store today, and the other one is delivered to the store today. So, that is new information. Okay. So, how do you have to do it? You have to kind of attach the new information to the main assertion. What is the main assertion in the two sentences? The first sentence, the main assertion is delivered. In the second sentence, sentence 14, the main assertion is baked. So, the new information delivered to the store today can be attached to the woman baked, or to the store today can be attached to the main assertion delivered. Let us see how that will work out. Now, reading a little bit more closely, I was giving you all the options. When the person reaches the prepositional phrase to the store, they have to attach this to the main verb delivered in 13, baked in 14, okay, or the recent verb baked in 13 and delivered in 14. So, there are two kinds of verbs there. The main assertion, however, is the young woman has delivered the bread. Okay. Now, the prediction is that listeners will find reading sentence 13 more easier. Let us read that again. The young woman delivered the bread to the store today. Okay, that she baked is there. The young woman delivered the bread that she baked to the store today. So, to the store has to be attached to this one, and then you can kind of get the correct reading out of it. Okay. If you kind of do this attachment in the 14th sentence, it will create a problem. See, how will that create a problem? The young woman baked the bread to the store today is going to create a problem. So, bake the bread that she delivered to the store today. In this one, the to the store today needs to be attached to the more recent verb. So, if you are following the main assertion heuristic, the 14 one will be more difficult, because you will have to kind of first attach to the store today to baked. You will realize that is not working. You will come back and attach to the recent verb. In the first sentence, however, it is very easy to attach to the store today to delivered, and that is the correct, easier, faster interpretation. Okay. So, this is if you plainly go just by the main assertion heuristic, but obviously you know the other heuristics as well. So, the late closure principle predicts that listeners should find sentence 14 easier, because they are, as they are processing the relative clause bread that she baked or bread that she delivered. Okay. If you again read this sentence, the young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store. So, for example, late closure says you kind of keep it on, you kind of keep adding whatever you can to the current phrase. So, the young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store. So, you kind of till delivered you can go on in one particular clause. That is how the late closure thing goes, and in that sense reading 14 is easier. So, in cases like this is a classic example of a garden path sentence. In cases like this, the garden path theory predicts that people will have no more trouble processing 13 than 14, because by main assertion 13 is easier, by late closure 14 is easier, and both of the effects kind of seem to get cancelled out by each other. So, that is precisely what is happening, and this prediction has been confirmed by measuring people's reading times, and what they have found is that the reading times are equivalent for sentences 13 and 14. Okay. So, if one was easier, another was difficult, then 13 would be faster or 14 would be faster, depending on what heuristic you are saying. But obviously, the theory says that you are aware of both kinds of heuristics, and because you are aware of both kinds of heuristics, both sentences are equally easy or difficult to read. Now, what happens in a case where the main assertion principle is deactivated? Then obviously the late closure principle is going to prevail. Okay. So, let us see another example, 15 and 16 sentences. Before the young woman delivered the bread that she baked to the store today, the clerk stacked the shelves. Before the 16 is before the young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store today, the clerk stacked the shelves. So, you kind of, it is basically two different sentences, and you have to kind of make sense of which one is easier to read. Now, if you see if you go by main assertion to the store, you cannot attach the clerk stacked the shelves to the main assumption there. To the store, the clerk stacked the shelves to the store cannot be attached. So, later closure principle operates, and hence reading 16 would be easier. I am just revising this. The clerk stacked the shelves is the new information. You have to attach it to the young woman delivered. That is not really going to work out, but the clerk stacked the shelf, the young woman baked the bread, that is going to be easier. So, for example, if you are just reading by late closure, you will read 16 as before the young woman baked the bread that she delivered to the store today, the clerk stack this. So this kind of leads to a longer read, longer clause, but makes the reading easier. If the main assertion is not there, if that principle is not operating, then obviously you will find reading sentence 16 easier by the principle of late closure. That is all for today. I hope I am not really confusing you a lot. This is a slightly dense chapter, and you have to kind of do a little bit of reading, then trying to understand. Obviously you can ask any number of questions you want on the forum itself. Thank you.